talk a little bit about the interview itself. Now, you've got to do, again, that research of who will you be interviewing with. And sometimes we all know that we'll get a call from a recruiter or a scheduler or an assistant, and we may or may not get the information. They'll say, we've got an interview scheduled with you, next week at 2 o'clock. If you don't get what you need, ask a question, ask follow-ups, use your resources so that you understand who you're interviewing with, understand the where. Depending on the institution, it's hard to get around. It's hard to find a location. It's difficult to park. You may or may not understand the nomenclature and the numbering and lettering scheme. So again, be sure that you know where you're interviewing and how you're going to get there. And again, ask detailed instructions and arrive early. That doesn't mean show up super early to your location, but get on those campuses early. The campuses that I'm familiar with are hard to navigate. And so if you haven't been on this particular campus, do a drive-by, get there early, go the day before if at all possible. And this may seem like a no-brainer, but know what to wear. Depending on the culture, they may give you instructions or insight as to what to wear. My advice is always dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Always dress up a level. It's easier to take a jacket off, to remove a tie for the gentleman, to roll up your sleeves. Ladies, it is real easy to blend in no matter what the dress is in a black pantsuit or skirt suit. So don't dress too casually, even if they say, oh, we're real casual around here, don't worry about it. Remember, your first impression in person, you can never get back. And so I'm always a little bit of a encourager to dress slightly up, not slightly down. And then understand the format. If you haven't interviewed in a while, formats have changed from 30 or more years ago, from 5 years ago. There's much more involved in availability in virtual interviews. Just like we're doing today in a GoToWebinar, interviews are conducted in webinars. There are opportunities actually for you to record yourself in a virtual interview where the institution is sending you questions and an avatar is going to read you a question, and then you have a countdown clock and you'll have 2 chances, potentially, maybe only 1, to respond to that interview question. It will record you, voice and video, and then it'll send it off to the interviewer for them to assess and determine who gets called back. If you've not ever had a virtual interview, then I encourage you to find a way to practice. There are resources. If you get invited to a virtual interview, often they will suggest some places for you to go practice. At our institution, we have a tool called Interview Stream, so I'd encourage you to investigate to see what might be available if you're already at an institution where you could practice. I will also say that group interviews are becoming more prevalent for entry-level jobs and for highly competitive jobs, and probably more administrative than necessarily faculty positions, although I am hearing a little bit in the faculty position as well. A group interview is different than a panel interview. A group interview happens with a collective of, a number of candidates that will come in together at a meet and greet or at a roundtable interview. And so this looks like 3 of us are coming in. We're all competing for the same job, and we are meeting, interacting, networking with the decision makers or a department or a group of students. And then through that process, impressions are made, conversations take place. And if you're not prepared or expecting it, it can be a challenge, especially if the group is asked a common question and everybody needs to respond. There's an art. You don't always dominate and jump in first. You might be seen as overbearing instead of take charge. You don't wait till last, because then what else can you add? Everybody's already added the comments, and you can't just say ditto what she said. So you have to be creative. So there is an art to being professional and helping, present yourself well without giving away your power. Another format is the panel interview. I would say that's probably a very common format, particularly in faculty positions. You might be interviewed by 3 or 4 or in some cases 10 or 12 individuals, and they're firing questions at you while you are answering those questions, and that will be considered a panel interview. There could be a simulation type of interview, and that's where you have to stand up and give a presentation. You will talk to a group of students or administrators. So you just need to really understand the format of the interview that you're walking into so that you can prepare as much as possible and you don't get caught off guard. So we've talked through most of these. So I want just to recap. We've got a phone interview. And if you've got a phone interview, there are a few things you need to think about. What is your connectivity? How quiet is it? If it's on your cell phone, do you have service? Can other people hear you and be heard? So how do you get a private, quiet, reliable space? Do you have enough battery power? That virtual interview, it's real time or recorded. The panel that we describe, the group that we describe, and then there is the on-site visit. And sometimes this is an extended visit. So you might be invited on site for a single interview. You might be invited in faculty or administrator positions for multiple interviews, multiple days, multiple departments, one-on-one, student panels, groups. You might see all of those that we have just talked about in an extended format. Often there will be a meal involved, or maybe 2. There could just be lots of activities that you would be involved in, and so you might walk into an itinerary that spans 6 or 8 hours. You've got to have stamina, you've got to have your preparation, be comfortable, and really engage in that dialogue. So let's talk a little bit about one of the methods to help you engage in the dialogue and present yourself professionally. You may not have heard of this format. It's answering behavioral questions in a STAR format. Now, as an interviewer for all of those years, I can tell you that sometimes candidates really connected with me, and I was able to follow their story and what their results and outcome and impact on an organization was. And there were other instances that the candidate was a great conversationalist, but at the end, I had no idea what they told me and what they could do for me as an organization. The way that you differentiate yourself is to talk about what you have done in actual examples with the actions that you took and the results that were achieved. Often interviewers, it depends on how they have been trained and how skilled they are, they might ask you very specific behavioral questions, which would sound like this. So, tell me about a time where you have had to make a difficult decision. What did you do? How'd you handle it? And what was the outcome? So that's an example of a behavioral question. Why do interviewers ask this? Well, there is absolutely evidence that past behavior is indicative of future performance. And so if I ask you a time when you've done something, I want you to think about in your past experience what you've done that might relate to that question. And then it gives me a good idea of what might happen in the future and how you might draw on that experience and be a great fit for me or not. Now, other interviewers may ask you a hypothetical question. So tell me about how you would make a difficult decision if you were faced with one. Now, in that situation, an unskilled interviewer is asking me a hypothetical because they might not realize that they can get a lot more information by asking me a past behavior. And I could make anything up that I wanted to because I'm just projecting what I might do if I imagine a hypothetical world. But here's what I want you to do. Whenever you're faced with a behavioral question or a hypothetical question, I always want you to answer with a specific example in a STAR format. You will knock the socks off of your interviewer and be positioning yourself as a fantastic candidate. I promise you. Now, how do you do it? So back to my example of a time when you've had to make a difficult decision. So here's how I might answer it. The situation or the task is simply the setup so that the listener can follow your story. Do not fall into the trap where you give me so much history and setup that I lose track and I get bored. You'll know your interviewer is getting bored when they start looking around, fiddling with their notes, turning on their pencil, tapping, fidgeting. You know those body language signals. If not, be aware of those body language signals. So the situation and the task is just enough for setup. So in my example, I might say, well, I had to make a decision about giving some difficult feedback to a team member. When was I going to do it? How was I going to deliver it? So the task facing me was deciding when and how and who to involve in that conversation. Then I transition into the actions that I took. And my actions need to be the meat of my story, and it needs to be what I did. I called and scheduled a conference room. I gathered all my documentation. I made the decision that I needed to do it first thing in the morning tomorrow instead of waiting a week or a month. I involved the person that needed to know. I sat down, prepared my remarks. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I anticipated any feedback or any resistance, and I proceeded to deliver the conversation. Now, the result was we had about a 30-minute conversation. I covered X, Y, or Z points. The employee gave me their part of the story. We agreed that there were some pieces missing in my investigation. We decided what the action plan was and how we're going to fix it and what we're going to do going forward. And I'm pleased to say that that particular situation has not happened again. We've rectified it. And I'm glad I moved forward instead of waiting and dragging my feet and not dealing with it. So that would be an example of how I could talk about what I did. Very little feedback or very little info on the situation. I don't have to call names or circumstances, but I talk about what I did and what the outcome was. And what employers are looking for are the results that you have and how you can make an impact on their organization. So let's look at it. And I want you to try it out. I'm going to pause. I'm going to let you read the question. Think about it, and I want you to jot down a couple of notes on how you would answer this question. Tell me about a time you worked with a difficult team member. What happened? What'd you do? How'd it turn out? So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, not enough, but about 30 seconds to think about your answer. Use the letters at the top of your screen. Now, I know you might need time, but when you start to think about how would you respond with your situation, your task, and then the actions that you took and the outcomes, your answers become much more robust. They become very complete. And if you've done a great job, your interviewer may want to ask you some follow-up questions that lead to other information and other outcomes. Now, there are some great follow-up questions, and then there's follow-up questions you need to be aware of. If your interviewer says, so what happened? What'd you do? How'd that turn out? You're missing part of your answer. You're missing the R, the result. But if they say, wow, that sounds like a great outcome, has that ever happened to you again? Have you done this before? If they ask, follow-up subsequent questions, then you know you've done a good job. You've intrigued them, they want to know more, and they're ready to engage in a dialogue. That's the win. But again, if you're getting the follow-up question, so what did you do? Give me a little more detail. How did that turn out? what did you learn from that, then you are not being complete enough for the interviewer, and that gives you the feedback, and that's why you need to practice. So here's how I might answer that question. My last team, there was a person that didn't pull their weight. So I was paired up with them on a project, and after they missed several deadlines, I had a choice to make: keep doing all the work or talk to them. I chose to ask them for their help, and so I created a task list. And then I could expand on the other actions that I took in this particular area. And then the result was they ended up helping to deliver 4 items on the project list. While they didn't do half the work, the 2 of us negotiated their involvement, how it impacted me. I made the choice to do extra work for the sake of the project, my overall team. We delivered the project on time and within budget. They acknowledged my contribution and later apologized for being less than a 50% partner. So the result is really where you expand on your contribution. I also want you to notice that I did not hesitate to use I when it was my work, my contribution, what I did. In our culture, we have a tendency and sometimes a habit to mask work that we have done individually with the collective of we or our. An employer doesn't want to know what your team did or what we did. They want to know what you did. So notice in my answer, I used I when it was I, and then I used we when it was our work. And that's how I want you to really focus on the words that you use. Words matter, word choices matter. So watch the I and the we. So don't forget, when you are answering your questions, be specific. Do not be general. Do not say, I talked to them in my last example. Tell me what you did. I scheduled a time. I made my notes. I had my deliverables. I had examples of where they had failed. I had examples of what I had done to make it happen. That's where it is specific. Talk about results. Do not skip the R. And describe what you did, not what we or others or a team did. Now, you have to really practice that whole process. And the next question that I get is, well, can I know what is going to be asked of me in an interview? So let's see. In order to do this, you've got to make sure first that you analyze the job description, and then you can figure out what comes next. You print it, you save it. Postings disappear. Do not count on the job posting to be out there forever. It may not be. You match your experience with the requirements in that job posting. Make sure that you understand what you've done and how you've done it, and then you determine where you have some skill gaps or some match gaps. And you then begin to prepare. You write examples for each one of those experience factors that you found in the job description. That's where you're working on those STAR answers. You identify likely challenges to how you're going to do the job. You think about the ideas that you could bring to the table, maybe ideas that you have brought to the table in other situations. And then you identify those potential questions and you prepare answers. So